actually, this was a great segue into the various perspectives I'm going to give you from the Public Square Community's work in 2 pilot communities. So these were actually great questions, and it was great to follow that particular presentation so that we can continue the dialogue about mitigating housing through citizen engagement. So again, my name is Liz Sosa, and I actually live in Garden City, Kansas, but I work with a community group by name of Public Square Communities. Jeanette Siemens is also in the back of the room today. She's raising her hand. She's partnering with me in this particular housing pilot. So again, any and all questions can be directed to both of us at some point. I'm actually just going to be brief because I really have a different perspective on the way that we have gone about this particular housing topic. Public Square Communities really prides itself on being the convener of community conversations. If you had to ask me to sum up what it is that we do, we host, we facilitate, we convene community conversations in rural communities. To that end, housing has really become a very prevalent topic as we go about having these conversations. We ourselves actually work around a very strategic process, and that process starts with what we consider to be the public square. When Terry Woodbury founded this particular organization, it was with the intent that all community decisions, that true civic engagement and community sustainable change starts with bringing together members of the 4 sectors of your community. And so every bit of work that we do with our existing communities, with the special projects we engage in, really centers around making sure that all 4 sectors are represented at that particular table for whatever dialogue it is that we're having. So again, just briefly, education is your typical K through 12 education, post-secondary, anyone with really the educational element in mind. The human services represented by the House is actually the broadest of all of our sectors. It is anybody that protects the family unit or the individual. So this ranges from healthcare, civil organizations, social service, social welfare, not-for-profit organizations, churches, you name it. Business, the green storefront, really is anyone who protects the tax base. So any of your taxing entities, the people who contribute to your tax base. Industry, manufacturing, agriculture, retail, service, and then finally you're looking at your government sector, not just your elected officials as we tend to invite to the table. We're really looking at this from the perspective of anyone in public service. So this could range from your police and your firefighters to your cemetery sexton to anybody in between. We're really looking at making sure that no matter what dialogue occurs, we do have representation from all 4 sectors present at those particular conversations. The reason we got to housing was because our process of community development really has brought us to this point. When we work with a community, we actually go in and through a series of interviews, dialogues, and finally a large-scale community conversation, we are allowing the community, through a citizen-driven process, determine what the goals are. Then we facilitate that same citizen-driven process to help accomplish those particular goals. We ourselves are not the consultant that you bring in to do the work, hand it off to you, put it in a binder, and stick it on a shelf. What we do instead is continually engage the community in conversations based on positive dialogue and assets within a community to reach goals, again, that the community has set. Over the course of about the last 10 years of our work, housing has risen to the top of the goals that communities wish to set for themselves. Something is missing in those particular communities that lends them to believe, much like you heard before, that there's either a perceived absence of adequate housing or that there is an actual gap in what exists and what should be. We use the word perception a lot because for most people, it's as real as the factual data. And so a lot of it is changing cultures as we go about that. In this particular case for the pilot community, Terry Woodbury had an opportunity to visit with the group that we refer to as our investors. It's a group of people who said, hey, we're really concerned about housing in our particular communities. What can we do to help mitigate that risk of us completely either dying or losing those abilities to impact the work that our communities are doing towards this end as well? We look at investors not always being financial investors, but investors in the long-term sustainability. So what they came up with was really that we've been kind of scaring off development in our communities for a long time. We are traditionally working in very rural communities, and as you know, roughly 60 to 70% of our state has communities ranging in population between 5,000 and less. You can see that most of our work really does take place in those particular communities. Really, we haven't seen a whole lot of new construction in rural communities over the last couple of decades. You know, number one, we've had an exodus of a lot of our people to more urban areas. Number two, the cost of providing housing in those particular communities has not risen at the same rate as the cost. So to build a home and what it's valued at are no longer the same. We build a house and what happens? Immediately, its value is less than what we just spent on the note to actually perform that particular construction project. So we're also looking at the fact of how do we realign some of those values, and then really how do we make sure that we are not limited by low income, moderate income, but instead are looking at what we would deem to be quality, affordable housing. Much different than just pegging it into a term of income levels or of demographic information. So what we looked at is we said, how could we investigate this further with our existing communities? Public Square Communities actually does work in roughly about 25 to 27 communities, which equals close to 60 towns. So our work is not just limited by a geographic boundary of a city limit. We actually work throughout the state with various regions, collaborative efforts, counties, etc. The first thing that we were really looking is how do we make sure that we are looking at housing from both an economic perspective and from a true housing stock perspective. How are we making sure that those two are aligned to some degree? In a lot of the communities in which we work, the big bad Z word is preventing us from doing a lot of meaningful future work. I mean zoning. Some sort of standard, some sort of expectation in an environment where most businesses and people already feel like they are either overtaxed or overregulated. So how do we approach this from a different perspective to where standards become an expectation, a quality norm that we share, versus more of an imposition, something that's imposed upon us without our real need? How do we close that financing gap? I'm from Western Kansas, so building something in Western Kansas, when you're looking at one or two properties at a time, or when you're looking at having to drive multiple miles between various communities, really impedes progress when you're looking at mass production, the scalability, if you will, of creating housing stock. How do we go back and align those property values with construction costs? That was a big one. These are all the different goals we were looking at. And finally, how do we invest capital both from a financial, human, and social element? Again, we're in the business of convening quality, positive community conversations. So housing sometimes does not feel like it would align in a community conversation, but it does. How do we bring your community to the table? How do we represent those four sectors so that the dialogue that occurs, much like we just heard, happens at the front end rather than the end when we're trying to sell them a project? But also, how do we engage the community from start to finish? How do we make sure that as a community, we have representatives that are not only serving from the investigative standpoint, the research, the dialogue back and forth with our communities, and as we proceed, how are we constantly filling in our community on what's happening, what's occurring? So we were looking at it from all of these different elements, and we narrowed down two of our actual communities that we decided to pilot this particular process in. The reason these two communities were chosen, Humboldt and Greeley County, Tribune, as most of you would know it, was that they had not only been in the Public Square community process the longest, but they both had active housing action teams, meaning that they, through their goal-setting process, had actually brought together a group of citizens from the four sectors who were working on this particular issue. Really, we looked at them from the perspective of comparable. One was on the east side of the state, one was on the west. Population-wise, demographic-wise, they were somewhat relevant. So we would be comparing apples to oranges, we realized, but that we would actually have some sort of baseline information from which to look. The process took us about 13 months for this initial pilot. And when we look at a pilot, much like we facilitate a community conversation, we do not go in with any intended outcome. We merely facilitate the agenda that is citizen-driven. So we even went into this pilot not with an outcome other than the goals we were trying to accomplish. If these are the primary topics, how do we look at those and how do we start gaining some sort of results that we could move forward and apply to other communities? We introduced the pilot to the community through a community conversation. And our communities are aware of that process. Really what it entails is making sure that we fill a room much like this with the 4 sectors, with demographic representation, age, socioeconomic background, new to the community, has lived there their whole lives to the community, all of those different aspects, so that when we finish, we have a room that looks much like this. If someone were to walk in to that particular conversation, they would not be looking around saying, oh, it's the same group that's always there. It's the same group of decision makers that's always there. We really do aim to make sure that we have adequate representation. From there, we actually received the go-ahead from the community saying, we're looking at housing and we want to do this in a rather investigative way. We really want to dig much deeper than the surface. So, if you will, taking some sort of housing assessment and taking it even deeper. How do we really take each of those components and turn it into a relevant action item for this particular community? I'll use the example of Greeley County. They actually, from their original housing action team, had 2 different housing organizations established. One was a not-for-profit, one was a for-profit. In that particular case, we had representatives from both of those action teams on this particular pilot group. We had that banker, we had the realtor, we had the school, we had the hospital, who's one of their primary employers in the community. We had business owners, we had citizens, we had as much representation on this group as possible. In Humboldt, they actually combined their housing action team and their business action team to serve as their pilot team. So both approached it a little bit differently. They each did a strategic assessment, taking what could be considered to be a housing assessment tool such as Humboldt used, because they had applied for various grant applications. In others, it was more of the investigative. How do we go through and we rank our community? How do we do mapping? How do we color code so that we can actually look on this map and know who has a dilapidated property? How does this information be made public to the point where if you're that person on that map with the dilapidated property, everybody knows it? How do we start the dialogue about what this could look like? The other intent of really investigating this from a further perspective was the idea that we are not trying to only go after the existing resources. How do we re-engage some of our local investors, the folks that may have brought property outside the state? Or someone who really has only been nickeled and dimed for minor sponsorships who might actually be willing to invest large sums of money for their community. So we were really engaging in a much different way. From that, we were really making sure that the outcomes, what information was received back, was publicly shared along the way, so that no one could understand or no one could actually challenge this team saying that they themselves had the predetermined outcome. They actually presented to a group of statewide investors, so people who came together who helped formulate our case statement to begin with, and presented to them with their ideas. An example being, in Greeley County, they went in, much of them, if I'd asked their initial perception, saying, well, we need new housing. We need new housing. People come to town and they need a house. We don't have anything. And what they ended up with was the need for rental housing. That many people do come to the community, but they want to test it out first. They would like to do some sort of rental instead. Change the entire way that they went about cultivating investment and interest in building housing stock in their community. Humboldt, for example, also felt that they needed new housing, was struggling a little bit with how the house that was built through their construction trades program at their school somewhat devalued the other new construction properties because it bid out so low every year in comparison to maybe construction costs. They made back what they put into it, but not more. But they did have a realtor list that had 40 properties that never seemed to move off of the realtor list. So they actually decided to tackle those first as being their initial project instead. How can they really look at rehabbing and making them relevant, meaning instead of a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, maybe it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Maybe it's an expanded floor plan. Maybe it's updating and upgrading. Maybe it's taking care of all of the other code elements that may go into it. So really taking all of the data that they had received throughout all of these assessments, all of these various conversations, and apply them to an ongoing project. The key being that, much like we talked about with the other housing assessment tool, is that they were not actually seeking funding to fill a gap. They were identifying the gap and then seeking relevant funding. Humboldt was actually awarded one of the KHRC grants this year based on their proposal, based on this particular work. Greeley County continues to work with 2 developers on potentially bringing the type of housing that they need to their community. The ongoing really revelation of that is, again, how do you do an economy of scale? How do you continue to partner with neighboring communities so that housing in one could often benefit housing in the other? Or if you're bringing a developer to town who isn't from there, how do you make it worth their while to build in one and another? How do you start looking at zoning and property valuations in a way that really engages conversation throughout the whole community, so that in the event that you do add some form of zoning requirement or some sort of regulation, it's a community-based decision as opposed to one that's handed down. All of those different things were what we experienced in this particular pilot. I just wanted to be brief because it's really tagging on to much what was said about the housing assessment tool. And then as you hear from Jason in terms of true development, you'll see how it kind of connects the dots. Really, in closing, for us, it's more about how do we continue to have those particular conversations with your community as opposed to just specific decision makers, so that it's long-term sustainable and that there's complete buy-in from communities at large. So I'll be interested to hear any questions as we move into the transition to Jason's presentation.